A History of Us by Joy Hakim. Chapter 36. Woman, Hold Your Tongue. Anne Hutchinson was another troublemaker. At least, that is what some Puritans thought. Here was a woman with 14 children who was interpreting the Bible. No one objected to that until she began to question some of the ministers' beliefs. Soon, she was trying to reach everyone with her ideas about God. Governor Winthrop was outraged. Didn't Mistress Hutchinson have enough to do with all those babies to feed? What was worse, in Winthrop's view, was that people were listening to her. Even men were listening. There was a reason. Anne Hutchinson had a fine mind, and she loved God. Besides, what she was saying made sense. Winthrop admitted that she was a woman with a ready wit and bold spirit. Before long, Massachusetts was split between people who believed that Anne Hutchinson said and those who believed the ministers. She claimed God was guiding her. The ministers said they were doing God's work on earth. Finally, the Puritans held a trial. You can read the court records for yourself. You may agree that Mrs. Hutchinson was smarter than her accusers, but that didn't help her a bit. She was kicked out of Massachusetts and put out of the Puritan church too. She moved to Rhode Island. Later, Anne Hutchinson moved to New York and was killed by Indians. Governor Winthrop saw it as the judgment of God. In those days, women, like children, were expected to be seen but not heard. They belonged to their husbands. The word for them was chattel. That means a piece of property. A husband could sell his wife's labor and keep the wages. If she ran away, she was accused of stealing herself and her clothing. Her husband even owned her clothes. Anne Hutchinson wasn't the only strong woman to trouble John Winthrop and the Massachusetts Bay Puritans. Her best friend was a problem too. Mary Dyer followed the ways of Anne Hutchinson. When Anne Hutchinson was cast out of Massachusetts, Mary Dyer and her husband, William, and other believers went with her. Later, Mary Dyer took a trip back to England and found other truths for herself. She became a member of the Society of Friends, the people who were known as Quakers. Quakers call their church services meetings. In a Quaker meeting, everyone is equal. Anyone may speak out, and there are no ministers. Now, in the 17th century, equality was not fashionable. Besides, Quakers refused to swear oaths of allegiance to anyone but God. But oaths of loyalty to king and country were expected in England and everywhere in the 17th century. You need to understand that the church and the government were all part of one package in the Old World. It was the church that gave the king his right to govern. It was called the divine right of kings. It was the government that gave the church support and lands. That was the way it had always been. It seemed as if people like the Quakers wanted to mess things up. The Quakers believed in toleration, and they believed each person could think for himself. What happens if you let people think for themselves? Why, the next step might be for them to say that the king's church and the king's priests weren't needed. And Quakers did say something like that when they sat in their meetings without ministers. So maybe you can see why Quakers were hated and persecuted by the authorities in England. They weren't liked any better in the colonies. The magistrates of the Massachusetts Bay Colony passed harsh laws to keep them away, but that didn't stop them. Some Quakers seemed determined to be martyrs, and Mary Dyer was one of them. She came to Boston and was sent away. She came back. This time, she was tried, with 2 Quaker men, and all 3 were led to the gallows. The men were hanged, but at the last minute, Dyer was sent off to Rhode Island. She came back again. The Puritans tried Mary Dyer again. This time, they offered her her life if she would leave Massachusetts forever. She refused. Mary Dyer was hanged on June 1, 1660, on the Boston Common in front of where the State House stands today. Her death was too much for some Puritans. In 1661, the law was changed. Today, statues of Mary Dyer and Anne Hutchinson can be seen on the Common. Pictures and sidebars. Anne Hutchinson on trial in Boston in 1637. A Quaker meeting. At Quaker meetings, the congregation sits and meditates in silence. Sometimes a member feels that God is communicating with him or her directly. The friend might start talking aloud about this inward light, or might shake and tremble, which was how the Quakers got their name. Mary Dyer going to the scaffold. A martyr is someone who would rather die than give up his or her belief. A gallows was the two standing poles and crosspiece from which people were hanged. From a Massachusetts court record, 1637. Anne Hutchinson. Therefore, take heed how you proceed against me, for I know that for this you go about to do me. God will ruin you and your posterity, and this whole state. Mr. Nowell. How do you know that it was God that did reveal these things to you, and not Satan? Mrs. Hutchinson. How did Abraham know that it was God that bid him offer his son, being a breach of the sixth commandment? Deputy Governor Dudley. By an immediate voice. Mrs. Hutchinson. So to me by an immediate revelation. Deputy Governor. How? An immediate revelation? Mrs. Hutchinson. By the voice of his own spirit to my soul. Governor John Winthrop. Daniel was delivered by miracle. Do you think to be delivered so too? Mrs. Hutchinson. I do here speak it before the court. I look that the Lord should deliver me by his providence. Governor Winthrop. The court hath already declared themselves satisfied concerning the things you hear, and concerning the troublesomeness of her spirit, and the danger of her course amongst us, which is not to be suffered. Therefore, if it be the mind of the court that Mrs. Hutchinson, for these things that appear before us, is unfit for our society, and if it be the mind of the court that she shall be banished out of our liberties, and imprisoned till she be sent away, let them hold up their hands. All but three held up their hands. Governor Winthrop. Those that are contrary minded, hold up yours. Mr. Coddington and Mr. Coldburn only. Mr. Jennison. I cannot hold up my hand one way or the other, and I shall give my reason if the court require it. Governor Winthrop. Mrs. Hutchinson. You hear the sentence of the court. It is that you are banished from our jurisdiction as being a woman not fit for our society, and you are to be imprisoned till the court send you away. Mrs. Hutchinson. I desire to know wherefore I am banished. Governor Winthrop. Say no more. The court knows wherefore and is satisfied.